Welcome, everyone. Just so you know, we're at the Grieving as a Communal, in case you stumbled into the wrong room. Um, it's a little silly of me to say I'm very excited for this panel, but I am, maybe because it's such a, I feel, not discussed enough topic. But, Becky Benson is here, Jesse Fein, Megan Fox, and Julia Vitarello, and I'll leave it to Megan to kick things off.
So thank you all so much for being here too. I have a little request. Seems like a smaller group here, and we want to make sure that this is a really authentic and comfortable conversation that allows folks to feel that they can share about a difficult topic. If you're willing to come a little closer, we won't bite. That would be great. Come join us. Talk even more intimately there. But yes, my name is Megan Fox. And I am, to give you a little bit of an introduction about myself, I am a certified child life specialist. So I have development training with helping families and patients and siblings cope with trauma, injury, loss, grief. Worked for 13 years at a hospital called UNC Children's in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I've always had a very large passion for connecting folks who have similar experiences, especially parents and caregivers and siblings. From there, I transitioned recently and be the program director of a local nonprofit in North Carolina called the Fein Foundation, providing financial assistance and emotional support to patients and families at UNC Duke and Wake Med Children's Hospitals. So the story line is it was founded over 18 years ago in memory and honor of a little boy named Folden Lee that he was treated for acute myelogenous leukemia. And anytime anyone asked him, even at 2 years old, how he was doing despite the harsh chemo or the stem cell transplant that he went through, he always responded with "me fine." So I find it very fitting that I'm here in this month, especially being with this panel here with these wonderful caregivers and parents who are going to share about their personal experiences. Folden passed away in the month of September, and his mother started our foundation at her kitchen table to honor her son's legacy, and so channeled her grief into a way that is helping so many families in the North Carolina, the state. And so, yeah, it's humbling, and the connection there, and to honor him, and that our foundation is 18 years old now is very fitting, and I'm just very honored to be here. So want to introduce our incredible panelists that each are parents, caregivers with a lived experience. So we'll start with Jessica Fein first.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jessica, and I am mom to 3. My daughter, Dahlia, passed away months ago, a week after she turned 17. Dahlia was diagnosed with Murph syndrome when she was 4 years old, which is a mitochondrial disease. And at the time, I didn't even know what mitochondria were. I mean, it was syndrome. We entered a really foreign space. But she developed somewhat normally for several years. Murph syndrome is degenerative, which is particularly cruel punishment, as many of you probably know. So when she was 9, she caught a cold, and that cold landed us in the hospital for 3 months. And when she left, she lost her ability to walk, to talk, to eat, and to breathe without a ventilator. And she lived years, and many of those years were still great, and she was vibrant. The last few years, she lost her ability to move. So she was frozen during COVID. She couldn't even blink. We had to tape her eyes shut at night. And 6 months ago, she passed. And so I am in it with the grief. And one of the things that we'll probably get to is I've had a lot of loss in my life. And what I'm learning is that the kinds of grief, the grief that I've experienced before has been what I call Hallmark card grief. It's the grief we all understand, right? You can buy a card for it. And the grief that I think we're going to be talking and that many of us are going through is a lot more complicated than.
Thank you for sharing that, Jessica. Want to introduce our next panelist, Becky Benson.
Hi, everyone. I'm Becky Benson. I also am mom to three. My oldest daughter, Skylar, and my youngest son, Justin, who is adopted, and our now middle child, Miss Elliott, had Tay-Sachs disease, and she passed away when she was 3.5, and that was 10 years ago. So Tay-Sachs disease is a recessive genetic neurological condition that is also degenerative. There is no cure. And so most children affected with infantile Tay-Sachs disease without excessive interventions will live between the ages of 3 and 5. So that was a very typical disease progression for us with her care. And I have been affiliated with the National Tay-Sachs and Allied Diseases Association for 13 years now. And I have been working with them as their family services manager is now my current role. I've been an employee for 8 years. I am also a peer support specialist through the Child Neurology Foundation, and I am a grief writer as well. So I am a little further out in my grief, and I feel like I've ridden many grief over the time since her diagnosis, beginning with anticipatory grief and potential losses through where we are now and realizing the ways that that still continues to present. And then obviously in my work with the Tay-Sachs Association and the various diseases that we support, supporting newly diagnosed families from the moment of diagnosis, unfortunately, through bereavement, and helping them along all of those stages as well. It's very cathartic. I feel that it definitely gives me meaning in what would otherwise be my misery, and it continues to help make Elliott's voice meaningful. I continue her legacy, and I feel very honored to be charged with her voice.
Thank you, Becky. I'd like to introduce our last panelist, Julia Vitarello.
My name is Julia. My daughter, Mila, I'm going to start by it's grief, and I feel like it's so important that we're having this discussion. And my daughter, Mila, passed away a year ago at age 10 from Batten disease, which is just a horrible neurodegenerative disease that just, I know there's some of you in the crowd that have a direct relationship with Batten, and robbed my totally seemingly healthy little girl that was running around and singing and playing and skiing and riding bikes, and lost all her abilities and died. And it's been quite the roller coaster. I started a foundation, like many of you have fought for my daughter really hard, to a pretty amazing treatment. Stopped her disease for a year and had improvements, and then it was too late for her. So I've gone on a huge roller coaster, and I think that when I was invited to speak on this topic, I usually speak on science and treatment, so this is new for me. I remembered a moment when I was fighting for Mila within maybe a few months of her being diagnosed at age 6. I met a mom at an event I was trying to raise money at, and I heard that she had lost her son in a motorcycle accident when he was 7. And I went up to her, because at that point I was in fighting mode, like, I'm not going to lose my daughter. And I just said, she said, I have more children now. And she was happy. And I looked at her and I was like, how do you look? And she just said, I talk about them all the time. And I will never forget that conversation, because it's what's helped me get through all this. So I just really appreciate all of you guys even being here and willing to talk about what no one wants to talk about, which is like the center of rare disease and its grief, whether it's a child or about to lose a child, or like wondering if the entire rest of your life is going to be grief because you have a child that has something that's lifelong. And so Daniel, thanks for just bringing up a topic that at first I was like, I don't want to talk about this. I want to talk about the science and treatment. It's really important to talk about this as well.
Just realized as we're talking about grief, we probably should have tissues readily available. Thank you, Julia, for stating that and sharing that. I just want to first and foremost just say a thank you to wonderful parents and caregivers up here sharing their stories about Mila and Dahlia and Miss Elliott, and just being comfortable and being vulnerable in a setting that's talking about something that not a lot of people want to talk about, and acknowledging how difficult it is, but how well. So thank you. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, so before we get into our questions and kind of get the conversation going, we wanted to show this graphic up here, something that I found. we often say that there are stages of grief, yet grief doesn't have a stage that you start with, progress, and finish. Grief isn't linear. It ebbs and flows. It's processed differently from each person. It also encompasses many things. And I love that this graphic up here shows all types of things that you could potentially experience. But then I love that someone filled it out and said, this was my experience. I mean, it's like all over the place, complicated. It's not, you know, a right way or a wrong way to grieve. There's so many depths in the waves that you all referred to as well. I just thought that that shared a really powerful story, and we want to keep that up there as we're talking as well. And again, Jessica mentioned some of this as well too, and Becky as well, that grief does encompass so many things. It could be the loss of a child or a loved one. It could be the loss of the familiar, the new normal, that even though, you know, you didn't expect that normal to be, grieving the, you know, the new diagnosis, the loss of routine, the isolation, so many things. So I'm going to start with Becky first with a question of what kinds of grief can you experience as an individual, as a community, and what do we mean when we say grieving as a community?
Yeah. Well, first I want to thank you all for allowing me to speak about Miss Elliott, because I know that sometimes when people find out that I have lost a child and they may be hesitant to ask questions, they apologize because it must be so hard for me. And it's not. I want to talk about Miss Elliott all day long. And I don't get to a lot because I don't have any new photos of her to share, and I never will. There are no new accomplishments that I can give to friends and family for updates on her life and progression. And in this world, I want to talk about my child just like everyone wants to talk about their child. And I desperately want her to be remembered. That's one of my goals as a grieving parent, is for my daughter's life to be remembered. She was here. She was a person who lived, and her impact made a huge impact on the world. So in grieving as a community, as I mentioned, first we have anticipatory grief at the moment of diagnosis. Everything we hoped for our child when we planned for her, with all of the bravado of youngness and health and anticipation for her future, went out the window. So it was at that moment that I knew that she wouldn't graduate from school. She wouldn't play soccer. Her father wouldn't walk her down the aisle. All of those hopes and dreams were gone in one fell swoop. And then we had to learn how to live anew with what we did have and what today meant. And I wanted to close myself off and go inside and close ranks as a family. And to some extent we did. But then what really pulled me was community and connection. And being with other families who looked like me and sounded like me and understood, and who didn't question whether I was laughing or crying, and supported me through however I felt, pulled me from the gutter that we were circling and back into a life that we could live, even with this diagnosis. When I went to my first National Tay-Sachs conference and met other families for the first time, children who were diagnosed with juvenile forms of these diseases. And I met Mallory, who was 3 years old and just beginning to show symptoms. And Mallory was a bubbly girl with the brightest eyes, walking around, batting her lashes. And I said to her mom, I can't believe that you've heard her say, I love you, and you're going to lose that. And she said, I can't believe you're never going to have that from Elliott. And that stuck with me. Because as another one of my friends now says, there's no bummer Olympics. You're not going to win the sad grief game. It's all difficult and it's all hard. And I truly believe that it's those connections that bolster us. I know that that's what got me through. As a community, it means knowing and accepting and understanding that people are grieving different things, different stages at different times, but we can all be there together for each other.
Thank you, Becky. Incredibly powerful to share, and just the importance and the value and the benefits of connection, and just how that makes such a difference, for sure. Want to turn our next question, and also too, if you want to speak on any of these questions, feel free to speak up as well too. But our next question is, how may grief be experienced by a parent, a caregiver, a sibling, friends and family, and the community at large? I'm going to direct that to Jessica to share first.
I remember all those different.
I can repeat if need to as well. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for what you just said, and I feel the same way about Dahlia in terms of wanting to talk about her, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity. And I love that you talked about when we're young and we come with this bravado about all the things we expect our life is going to be. And I for sure had that as well. My husband and I adopted our 3 children from Guatemala. The hard part was over once we had our family. And so the first question there was about how it can be experienced as a parent. And we had a lot of bravado even with the diagnosis. We thought, okay, so she's got this like scary disease never heard of, and what are mitochondria, and it's degenerative, and that's okay, but like we're going to be fine, and she's going to be fine. And, you know, for me, the word grief was really associated with death. And I had lost at that time one of my sisters, and I subsequently have lost my other parent and my other sister. And so that was grief that I understood. And I felt like I refuse to grieve my daughter while she's right in front of me. And I look back on that and I'm like embarrassed because there was so much to grieve. And yes, she was alive, and we were going to be, you know, creating a life of joy in every way we could. And that was so important to us. But losing a lot. And it was the anticipatory, as you discussed, but it was also the fact that everything she was learning, she was also losing at the same time, right? So she was, you know, we were trying to cram all this knowledge into her because we were going to be losing because we knew it was degenerative. And so we lost, as I said, all of this functionality. And I always said, I wished I had known the last time she was going to smile that it would be her laugh, you know, but I didn't know, because each of the steps it felt like it was so slow, and it also felt like it was like that. So I think one of the things that parents can feel, sorry, because I know there were a lot of people I'm supposed to, but this idea of ambiguous grief, which was accepted for me. And so the idea that this person can still be here and she can still be with us, but we're losing pieces of her. And so that was something that was really profound for me when I learned about that. And there was a name for this thing that I had been feeling, and I didn't know it existed. So I think that's for parents, and I think for caregivers, you know, it's interesting. We had a couple of caregivers who felt it was too intense, and they left us. They had formed such connections with Dahlia, and when they saw her information, it was too painful for them. But the other one that I want to talk about that was on your list is siblings. And I think that for us, this was really important because my husband and I, really wanted to make a life for our whole family, for Dahlia and for her siblings, that had joy and happiness. And I believe you can do that no matter what your situation is. But we went a little too far in terms of the front we put on for our other kids. And we were very, you know, we were strong, and we've got this. And one night our eldest came to us and broke down and was just hysterical, raw, hysterical, sobbing, and said, "Something's wrong with me." We were like, "Oh shit," you know, like what's wrong with you? And he said, "You know, I'm praying and I'm praying and I'm praying, and she's not getting better, and I'm so sad and I'm so angry. But I look at you two, and you're fine. What's wrong with me?" And I thought, boy, we messed up, because trying to be so strong for our kids left them thinking they weren't doing grief right. And to your point, there's no doing grief right. And it was a real turning point for us. So I think for the siblings, to get to your question, there's just as much loss and there's so much confusion. And if I were doing it again, which I hope I am not, I think, having honesty for the siblings that they developmentally can understand is important, because for siblings that loss is not only the loss of their normal life, but it's the loss of the attention of the parents, because the fact is that child who needs you is going to get the vast majority, and it's a loss of their childhood too.
Yeah, absolutely. You bring up so many good points about trying to almost protect siblings from seeing too much or putting on such a front. And I've always, encouraged parents to just be direct, which of just saying, this is really hard. There's going to be times when you see mom cry. There's going to be times when you see mom as stoic as possible. There's going to be times when you see potentially mom scream, or and you're trying to be so mindful of doing so much of that in front of them. But and kind of meeting the siblings where they're at with what questions they might have, or not pushing them to want to talk about it. I've had moms ask me before, my child doesn't know about his sister. It's really hard. It makes it difficult. How do I approach this? How do I, meet them where they're at? How do I encourage it? Because I want to make sure that they have a chance to process it, and always encouraged finding someone that could go hard as a parent as well to talk about that. Is there a support person that you can reach out to connect them with as well? But you brought up so many incredible points. Thank you. Want to direct the next question to Julia. How have you found ways to help with living with grief?
There have been many phases of grief. So I think the first one, and it's a little different than the stages of grief, I would say it in a different way, is when my daughter was diagnosed. I thought she had an eye problem. I thought she had a vision problem, or she had a walking problem. I had no idea that doctors were going to tell me she was going to die in 5 years. That period was locking myself in a closet was how I dealt with it. I could not be around any other person that just had a normal life. It was too hard for me to have people talk about kind of mundane things and, crying over broken sunglasses and, having long discussions about whether their kid could get into like a ballet class. I was completely incapable of being around other people. So I needed to spend a lot of time with myself. I did a lot of walks and hikes, and literally lying on my closet floor was my safe place. And I just needed to reflect on how I was going to get through any of this. And fighting for my daughter, I had to put blinders on, and that included in my own relationship with a not very happy marriage and friends who were not very supportive of me. And I had to just fight, and that was a grief of I'm trying to do something that's 1 in a million, and I'm putting all my time into it. And a grief for me was that I was losing the time with my child. So I chose to fight for her and have less time with her. And I lost lots of time where she spoke her last words and did things for the last time. I was still her mom, and I was there, and I had a little baby at the same time. But I was like, I have to, there's this glimmer of hope with genetic medicine. I've got to fight for her. So I grieved over my decisions at that time too. And then as, I kind of neared the end of my daughter's life, that was probably the hardest thing for me. I mean, it was just so unbearable. Just knowing your child has a neurodegenerative disease, they're going to die. And in my case, I'd fought for her. She had a treatment. It looked so positive, but I wasn't in time. And the decisions that I had to face, for my daughter, just no parent should ever have to do. And I fear that hundreds of thousands or millions have to face the same questions I had to face about what my daughter would want, who had been running around and laughing and smiling, what she would want now that she couldn't take a fly off of her nose. And that grief was just unbearable. It was like a knife through me all day long, every day. And I remember going on a walk a month before my daughter died, and I was like, just hit fast forward. All I want to do is hit fast forward because I know where I have to be, and I just have to get there. And that grief was just extraordinary pain. And I didn't really I have an amazing partner who had gone through a lot of loss, and thank God I had him to talk, because no one else wanted to talk about a dying child. I couldn't talk about it with my own mom. She was going through chemo. She was my rock, and I couldn't bring her down. I couldn't bring anyone down. Luckily, I had a person, that was willing to listen, but my world was very small then. On the other side, lost my daughter. I talk about her. That's one thing I just said earlier is I'm lucky enough to work in rare disease, and I run a foundation, and I run an academic collaboration, and I run a company all around rare disease. And when I'm in meetings with people from the FDA and the NIH and academics and companies, they always say to me like, oh, well, Julia, if you're getting, because they bring up my daughter, she's setting a precedent in medicine, and they bring her up all the time in conversation, and they always say, well, if it gets sad for you, like, you can take a pause, and we can stop the meeting and whatever. And I've really made a conscious effort to say, no, like, I want you to, if I cry, I'm not going to cry the whole meeting, because then we're not going to have a meeting. But like, if I cry, it's okay, because you need to see part of rare disease. If we all squash the like sadness and grief, then the people that are making really important decisions on the medicine and the science are only going to see the statistics and the cold, hard facts. They're not going to see that living on the other side of this is every day. It's time. I have an 8-year-old son, and now I'm having to deal with his grief and not figuring out, I don't know idea how to handle that. I'm learning. But keeping it out there in this space in rare disease is just so important. And so I post on social media quite a lot. Photographs. I have a person come into my house who just kind of shows up and takes photos of my life, and I didn't know why I was doing that, and, and why anyone would want to see me alone now without my daughter. But I've gotten a really overwhelming response from people that feel that it captures their own grief and that it makes them feel like they're not alone. So that alone is helpful. So I really talk about it. I include it in the scientific, colder area, and try to just share what life's side.
That is so interesting to me, that the scientists and the people you're meeting with say, if it gets too sad for you, take a break. As though, first of all, it's not too sad every second of every day, but also like this idea that, okay, if it's too sad for you, like, you'll take a break for 5 minutes, you'll be sad, and then you'll come back, right?
And we don't have to experience it too, because they do not, the people in this area do not generally want to feel that sadness. They want to stick to like the facts of science and medicine and like what it could do, and especially men. Really don't feel comfortable. I've had many people leave dinners and meetings because they are in so much pain because they have children the same age as my kids, and they can't really imagine it. It's in balance of like pushing it too much, but just allowing it to be enough that it's part of the conversation of rare disease.
And I think that it's interesting because you're talking about it in a professional setting. I've seen it happen in friendships as well, where it's just too sad. I had lost her son a year ago, and she's lost a lot of friends since. And one friend said, well, it's just that it takes a lot to motivate to come be sad with you. Oh, Jesus, you don't want to be friends with that person anyway. But imagine it takes a lot to motivate to be sad with you. And I do think that people are uncomfortable around other people's sadness, particularly when it's something that they that is just the most devastating.
Yeah, and I would just bring one other topic up too, which, Effie, I'm not going to call you out except for just to say that a conversation we had recently was eye-opening for me too, is my partner now has a child with a lifelong neurodevelopmental disease. And one of the things I learned in this journey, not just with him and his dog, many of you, and Effie, your comment yesterday sparked this, is that it's easy. The three of us have lost children, and you associate grief with death, like you said earlier, right? And what I'm learning is that I used to think like, oh, the worst of the worst is losing your child. And there was a moment where to be totally honest, I thought, if I have to live in the situation that I'm in with my daughter and how I have to take care of her, and my just emotional grief, my physical, my neck, I was getting like arthritis in my neck from picking up my 65-pound daughter, completely leaving my son alone, who had like never learned to like ride a bike or do anything because I had no time for him. I thought that it was all about fatal diseases. And it was like, and then I realized, like, if I have to do this amount for the rest of my life, I'm going to die of cancer, like, no doubt about it, the next like 10 years. I was being pushed to such an extreme limit. And I have a new appreciation for just how hard the grief is around having a child with a lifelong, possibly lifelong, we don't know, kind of neurodevelopmental disease. And had the experience with my partner to be around his daughter, and the uncertainties of like living the rest of your life with like, is my daughter going to live the rest of her life, or maybe she's not, and is she going to have any friends? Is she going to, am I going to be a caregiver the rest of my life and changing at 45 years old, and you know, has her period? And like, you know, these are things that need to be talked about. And Effie, your comment, I don't remember what we were talking about last night, but is just like, there's so much grief around the loss of what you thought your life was going to be, and that you have to live this for like the rest of your life. And me, as a parent who's lost a child, that seems so unbearable and grief stricken and sad and hard, you know, that it deserves to have as much, honestly, there's as much grief and it lasts your lifetime.
Yeah.
And I've heard numerous parents reach out to me saying, my biggest fear in life with my child that has a lifelong disease is that they will live one day past me. And I cry every single time someone says that to me, because I'm like, their biggest fear, child's gonna be alone because no one's gonna take care of them the way that they do. You know, and so I just want to make sure we always remember too that it's not just about losing your child, it's about, you know, losing, you know, your rest of your life and how you expected it would be for your child and you and your families and everyone around you, because that's another form of grieving.
Excuse me. And we live in a culture that's distance seeking and very ableist. And the reality is that most of us will become disabled in some way. So it's not that we will have a disabled body. It is that if you are lucky enough to currently have an abled body, that will likely not always be the case. And that down the road, you may come to a point where, or anyone in the world will likely come to a point to where they need support, or they are supporting someone, or they are experiencing grief, or they are supporting someone through grief. And it's not, everyone will die at some point, and most people won't just pass away in their sleep when they're 105. There will be a continual disintegration of your body, and that's not a fun thing to talk. I understand the distance seeking because it isn't fun. You know, when you go get your hair done and they say, how many kids do you have? And then that really doesn't go well. And they go, oh, well, what do you do for a living? You know, you're in for a treat. Because all roads lead back to this for me. But what I want the world to know is that saying, I can't imagine, is not helpful. If I could encourage everyone to tell everyone they know to make a tiny linguistic shift and say, I can only imagine, it's so much more affirming to the person going the tough situation. And you can imagine. You don't want to. I don't blame you. I didn't want to either. I just was not afforded that luxury. So saying I can only imagine, while I am sure those who say imagine do so with no malice whatsoever, or even forethought, knowing and understanding that it can be harmful is important. And if we can make that tiny shift, it becomes less distancing and more connected. Because it's true, you're not experiencing what I'm experiencing. I'm not experiencing what anyone else on this stage is experiencing or anything out here. I'm on my own path with my daughter, just like my husband is on his, or just like our children are. But we all have this connective space where we can understand both logically what's happening and in our hearts how someone feels. And it's that connection of thing that bonds us and bolsters us and takes us from loneliness and isolation to support and connectivity.
It's truly just being empathetic and really trying to have that empathy of imagining what that could be like. And like you said, it creates such a more of a connection than further distancing or isolation. You all brought up so many wonderful points that I feel like we could talk about this topic hours, all day. As you shared some things that you should not do, which I want to definitely get to that, can you each share how can you constructively support someone in your community who is grieving? What is helpful things to do? I know you talked about, Becky, the linguistic change of saying I can only imagine versus I can't. But what are some helpful ways to really constructively support someone who is grieving?
Sure. So I think, first of all, if I couldn't agree more. So there are things that people say, and again, trying to, be helpful, but it just makes it's just worse. Or, if you're going to be too sad, and I can't imagine. If there's proximity and somebody can come be with you, I do not find it helpful when somebody says, oh, let me know if there's anything you need, or if there's anything. No, I don't have time to think about what I need. So just do. So that would be one thing that I would say is a way to support. I think just being there, and you see really quickly who kind of just intuitively knows. The friends who come and they're there and they're quietly doing your dishes or doing your laundry or taking the other kids out for ice cream, and you didn't ask them to, because you're not even thinking what to be able to say. You should sink my dishes. Who cares? And they're just quietly doing those things. So I think that's just doing and not putting any further burden on the grieving person to figure out what she needs.
So important of just being able to do. And I think we've talked about too in skiing, how can I help? Just coming up with specific ways that you just go and do, whether that is doing the laundry or taking your other kids out, or because your brain is so overwhelmed in that moment, you don't know how to say how you can't help. And I know as a healthcare as well too, I had to be cautious of that in the hospital setting when I was working, because you wanted to be helpful, but those parents at that time, they couldn't even articulate in that moment, even making a linguistic change to of being productive and helping as well.
Yeah. And then also just saying, tell me about Dahlia. I'd love to learn about her. I'd love to know about her.
Yeah.
Because people think, oh, I don't want him to say her name because maybe I'll upset you, as though we're not constantly thinking of, and like everybody's saying, and we want to talk about them. So that's another thing. Maybe you're not going to be the one who's going to come over and quietly do the laundry, but you could call and say, hey, I'd love to learn some more about Dahlia.
Yeah.
And keep showing up. Good friend or a supporter is not a box to be checked and done and move on with. Keep showing up in the long haul, at diagnosis, at death if that occurs, 5 years later, 10 years later. And when I was in the deepest throes of my grief after Elliot died, and sometimes I get there again, I was already running myself into the ground, and I didn't realize it. And I wasn't managing my stress, ending that I was. And I would think I was pretending so much so that I would believe I was, so that I could keep going. And not out of performative grief. Authentically, that's truly what I felt I needed to do at that time. It just wasn't serving. I ended up in the hospital, and I ended up with hives. I recently ended up with shingles. So, like I said, I'm super fun. But in our loss of expectation and anticipatory grief and post-death grief, I was manic and crazy and horrible to be around. And that's grief. And it's not always pretty, and I'm not always graceful. And I just needed people to love me through those terrible times. I remember we had family that were going kayaking, and so they didn't want to burden us with that. And so, they didn't ask me to go kayaking because I couldn't. I was so mad. I should get to say no. Of course I couldn't go kayaking, but I should at least be asked and get to say no. Now, again, there was no winning with me. Mm-hmm. If you had come to me and asked me to go kayaking, I would have said, how dare you? You know I can't go kayaking. But please keep showing up. Please keep asking. Show up and do the laundry. And if you can't do that, don't ask what you need us to do. Everyone needs their laundry done. You know these things. Everyone needs a meal. Everyone has grass that needs, all of those basic things. But more than that, speak my child's name. I may shed tears when I speak about her, but hearing her name will never fail to bring music to my heart. Just keep showing up.
I agree with all of the things that both of you guys said. I would say the one thing that stands out in my mind is my son. The day after my daughter died, I had not, the hardest thing in the world for me was not just being a mom to my son, but he was going through grief and he was 6, and I could not figure out how to like stand up on my feet that day and like make a meal or even eat a meal that had been made for me and then take care of my son who like had no idea how to deal with the fact that our house was empty and my daughter wasn't there. It was so unbearable, and all I wanted was friends to come over and just do play dates with him and make and talk and ask him, and if he didn't want to talk about it, that was fine, but just keep him going, because I could not keep my son, like I couldn't feed him bed, I couldn't talk to him, and I had this like little being who was going through, I was like playing in fields when I was 6 years old, and this guy had just seen me carry my daughter dead out of my house, you know, when he was 6. And like, I just was like, this poor little guy, so much support, and I can't even take care of myself. And every day I remember thinking, like, if I could pick the phone up, I don't have the energy or the ability to do it. I would ask all my friends just to come over and like play with him and feed him a meal and watch a movie with him. Everything was going out towards like, how do I help my living child right now to get through this? And I had no ability to take care of him. It took me months. I actually realized after a few months that I had to relearn how to be a mom with him because I hadn't been able to be a mom to him. I looked like I had, but on the inside, I don't think I had. So my answer to that question would be is, if there is another child involved, is just to kind of really step in and try to focus on that child, and that will make parents a lot happier. Child is like at least starting to thrive a little bit.
Yeah, being able to have some one-on-one attention and time for them to process and play and just be a child. Yeah, have that as well. I know you all spoke to this a little bit already, but I feel like this is such an important topic and question to ask as well. What should you not do? I know we talked about linguistic change of saying I can only imagine versus I can't, but what are some other things that you should not?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would just say it's hard for average people who haven't gone through a lot of pain to even recognize this, but for all of them that are going through like lifelong pain and grief or whatever it is we all realize one thing is that nothing else in life matters. Your clothes and your cars and your house and your job and all the great things that other people care about do not matter. None of it matters except for the health of you and your children, and that's it. And so when people are around me and they talk about what I would consider more superficial things, and I feel a little bad because it's probably not superficial for them, it's just want to be around people talking about like how incredibly stressed they are they can't get their kid into a private school, or that their kid like didn't make the final cut of whatever basketball team or something. I have no tolerance for it, and I'm okay with it. Go for it, have the conversation, but have it around me when you know what I've gone through. It's a hard one. I don't want people to have to stop living their lives and live the life of someone that's like lost a child. But you know, even those that are living with lifelong children that, you know, are not verbal, that have meltdowns and in the supermarket, which I experienced with my partner and his daughter, and is just to not bring up just dumb shit like in front of people. You know, it's like, don't bring
in
up
general.
That you broke your sunglasses.
Don't bring up dumb shit.
That's good. I'll wear it. Yeah.
Can we sell that at the Global
It's
Jeans
not
Conference
helpful.
next year? Yeah.
So that would be my answer to that question.
I love that.
Don't bring up dumb shit. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm sticking with that one.
Yeah.
Don't bring up dumb shit. That says it all.
That's a good one. Do you have anything else to add to that, Becky? Or?
Well, I guess sort of to piggyback off of that also, it's so lonely and it's so isolating please continue sharing your life with me. You know, I still want to know what's happening, even if I couldn't be a part of it, or I still want to feel like my family could talk with me. And I know that it's politically correct to not want to quantify, you know, grief or things that happen, but it's true. I'm sorry, this three-legged cat had cancer, but that's really not the same as my daughter dying. But I guess part of me still wants to know. But from those close to me, you know, I still want to be a part of whatever is going on in their life, because I feel so removed and so isolated that I don't want to feel further edged out of whatever my life was. My life will never look the same again. I have to integrate now who I am with who I was then, and in friend groups and in families. But again, I think it all boils down to showing up.
Yeah. Showing up can be just, incredibly important. I was sharing this with Jessica earlier. Follow Adam Grant, a psychologist, on social media, and there was something that he shared recently that I feel like is relevant to share here, and then we're going to open it up for questions. Is I feel that many people only see grief as pain. They avoid it, they suppress it, they try to expel it, get rid of it. A beautiful alternative to that is grief is a form of either unexpressed or expressed love, enduring love, you know, holding on to it as a way of staying close to the people that we've lost. And so I think that's, you know, grief only exists where lost. So talking about Mila and Dahlia and Miss Elliott and hearing your stories, there's a lot of love, even talking about the sorrow of grief as well. So with that said, we'd love to open it up to anyone that has any questions. If you do, please come up to the mic so the folks virtually can hear you as well. Go ahead.
Thank you for sharing. Oh, if someone's not crying in here, then we probably should just step out. I just wanted to ask you, as an advocacy organ, I'm only a year in with Duke 15Q Alliance, and I'm often in that place of like, what as an advocacy group can we do? Because during that moment, we're not close enough by, you know, if I'm in North Carolina and a family's in Oregon, I can't go and step in and physically do something. So everything else kind of feels like a loss, like in the sense of like, this isn't enough. Like their child just passed away. Any advice or anything that you saw that just wowed you in the sense of like, they were there for me? I mean, we have a bereavement group. We have a counselor, that we have another parent who's been there that's available. But if there's anything like that you can suggest that we could take away from you all and what you learned and what was helpful, maybe nothing was helpful. Maybe just saying we're here, but I'd love to hear your feedback on that.
I say connecting people with people who get it, but it sounds like you're already doing that. And I know, you know, we've talked about that and some of the connections that you've made. Because we've talked about it's so isolating, and there's no for somebody to win. You don't want to hear the dumb shit, but you want to be invited kayaking. Like there's no winning. So that's why the connections with other people who are in it or who get it are so important. And as an advocacy organization, if those connections, and one of the things we were talking about is rare disease is, you know, rare. Like with Dahlia's disease, there are 6 others in the world who had it, and none of them are alive right now with the dual diagnosis. So I'm never going to meet anybody who's going through the exact same death, but it doesn't matter. I already, having known you for 40 minutes, like relate to you so much more. It doesn't have to be the, you know, exact same thing in terms of diagnosis, but it's people who understand and who get it, and who understand that, by the way, it's also okay if you want to laugh. I mean, that's the other thing. When you're in grief, people expect you to be in sorrow 24/7, and then if they happen to show up at a moment when you're not in the deepest despair, that seems weird. And then you feel like, you know, so people who get it, that it's also okay to have moments of levity, to have moments of happiness. Like that's fine, because it is love endure. Love is all of that.
I would just piggyback on it too. Is for me, it was really helpful when I was put in touch with very specific people. So it wasn't like, hey, there's a community. That seemed like overwhelming, and I had no desire to talk to a group of people that were grieving. Actually, leading up to my daughter's death, a number of people reached out. Some people I didn't even know, actually, just through social media. And they were like, hey, you should talk to Mary or whoever. And she lost her daughter 4 years ago to a different disease or whatever. I had a number of those calls. And I will say that it really, really helped me actually before someone lost their child. If you offered that to your community, if this is, if people are going to lose their children in this community, it was really, really helpful for me to talk to, in particular, one mom. I can't even remember, to be honest, her name or what her child had. But I remember I was in such a blur, preparing for this moment in my life that I know that was going to happen soon. And she said to me, I have a son too. And he was your son right now when he lost a sister. And I said, how did he react? And she said, he blossomed like a flower as soon as his sister died. And I remember thinking, like, that's really messed up. And you know what? My son did the exact same. And when I saw my son blossom, instead of being so heartbroken by that, I had a mom, a very specific mom that someone had put me in touch with, or else I would have never reached out to her, never known she existed. And that piece of advice has helped me so much, because now I look at my son and I can be okay with that, because I know that that's probably happening to lots of other parents. So just making a personal connection with like a person going through or having gone through what they're about to go through is helpful.
I would also add to just creating a space for siblings to connect as well, and how helpful that can be. At UNC, we created a program called SIBS Care. It stands for Connect, Acknowledge, Remember, and Empower. And any of what the activities or the programs or the camps that we provided that Fein helps support now too, was just putting them in a social setting where they could connect and thrive and be able to blossom in that way, but also be around someone else that gets it, and compared to their peers at school that probably don't. So special, settings for siblings to connect are really helpful and could be helpful too. I'm going to turn it to Daniel, who I think has a question from our virtual audience as well.
Yes, Amy Ward is attentively, and she's writing in. We recently have lost too many. Our group is small with not a lot of resources. I took the last death very hard. It was a strange, unexpected feeling for me, and I felt guilty for having so much grief. How can I help our community struggling?
It's emotional to be in this world, and for those of us who've not only experienced our own losses, but we continue to immerse in the world of others' losses as well, that can take an emotional toll long term. So again, in one of the earlier sessions this morning, we talked a lot about self-care versus self-comfort, and I know that that's hard to navigate and a difficult thing to manage. But even Daniel, you said this morning, you can't pour from an empty cup, and that's so true. But to be able to continue to do this work and to support your community, you have to make sure at your baseline and putting the right people in the right places so that you have that specific mom to reach out, to connect with. Maybe they had a child of the same onset or same age or same diagnosis, close across the country or whatever it is. Utilizing the resources that you have, and whether that's tangible resources, it's a pamphlet that you give out, it's online resources, it's a person, or you're sending Grubhub cards or whatever you do to show I care and I'm doing something in this paramount loss that nothing will ever be enough for, and just continuing to be there as they write lives and you write them with them.
And I would just add, I think you had said earlier, grief doesn't have an expiration date. And, I'm just 6 months in with Dahlia, but my first sister died in 1996 at age 30. I have friends, a couple, who still send me a card on, her birthday, who call me on the day, they know the day she died, who, or Mother's Day, reaching out on Mother's Day year over year when has lost their child. So again, not being like, okay, well, we're a month past now, so we're all moving on, but continuing.
In our practice discussions as well too, Becky, I feel like Jessica, you brought this up as well, that sometimes communal grief can trigger folks to double down their efforts to, start a foundation and get further funding for research and use it. And other times it may be you decrease your involvement, knowledge that it's a spectrum and you can land anywhere on that. So as a community, when you're grieving, when you know so many folks that, have experienced loss, it's okay to give yourself some grace when you need to take a step back and allow yourself to process. Said you can't pour from an empty cup. Being able to find ways to, all right, I need a breather before I try to step back in, or I need to take a second there. Yeah. Does anyone else have any further questions they'd like to ask?
I actually like your guys' opinion. Working for an organization, obviously, I'm not in your shoes. I don't have a kid who's terminally ill. I'm not expecting to lose a kid. Trying to come up with ways to support our families once their children have passed. And knowing we can't go do their dishes for them, we can't go take care of their other kids for them. One idea we came up with was either purchasing a star, naming it after their kid, or planting a tree in their kid's honor, doing those things to parents. Is that something, as parents who lost a child, that would be meaningful to you? Is that something that would kind of help preserve their memory?
We had, yes, as you can see, yes. We had a person, a colleague of my husband's, came over a few weeks after Dahlia passed and planted a dahlia garden in front of our home. And it's ridiculous. We didn't ask for it. And just today, every day, I get the pictures my husband sent me, like what the dahlias look like today. And of course, we spell our dahlia garden Dalia, which is how we spelled Dahlia's name. The idea of planting a tree particularly speaks to me, and maybe stars and other things for other people. But that idea is so gorgeous. And if there's a way to do that in a place that's close by where the person lives and they can watch that grow, or planting flowers, I think it's a stunning idea.
I would say that for me, one of the things, and I'm going to piggyback a little bit on what you said, because originally I would have said that no, that wouldn't have helped me. But you just made me think about the garden, which is such a beautiful idea. My daughter was cremated. We chose not to bury her, so I don't have a physical place to go. And I thought that would be okay. And instead, it's been really hard for me. I have places that I go that remind me of her, and they help. This is not something that's feasible for a lot of people, but maybe we could change it. Is like I'm having a bronze sculpture made of my daughter, and I've worked on that with someone. I had to help raise money, community of friends and family, which is kind of hard to make that happen. So maybe that's not feasible for every family, but something that it's been really therapeutic for me to work with the sculptor, because I've had to explain to her about Mila. And it's not about I'm learning. It's not about like finding a mirror image of, but it's telling her about her playfulness and how she liked to be in nature. And so she's kind of capturing that. And not only is the process helpful, but there will be a place that I know already that will be really meaningful for me. So that's a pretty Herculean kind of project, but if the thing along those lines, and it could be that it's like a sculpture that's small of an animal or a tree or a child or whatever, that could be something that could sit in their house, or like a garden that's something you can kind of always see and go with. That is where I have really been drawn to, is just a thing and a place that I can sit with by myself forever, and that it will be the garden or the sculpture where I can just feel like a little bit of peace. So I don't know if there's something scalable and that you could give a family that would do that.
And I know that we're out of time. I just want to touch really quickly to answer that question, also from an organizational standpoint of another resource, is we put together newsletters curated by bereaved parents that we now send out for an entire year. So once a month after their child dies, that just offers resources and support and links to articles and other things on things that they may be feeling or going through, so that they're supported in that first year in a specific way, and then at touch points thereafter as well.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that as well, I know in the hospital setting, families also felt when they lost a child, they grieved losing the family they had created with the healthcare providers, and so they were connected to us and not be forgotten in some ways. And there's a really wonderful second to that as well too. There's a really wonderful resource if it's a pediatric loss called the Healing Book that has prompts for families to do together about who they have lost, that encourages them to do activities that makes them think and remember to talk about it, to do it in a way that, writing about it, drawing about it. We used to give that out a lot to families and provide that resource. Just created a space to talk about their loved one. Any last questions? I know we're at 12:03, so and probably people are hungry and need to stretch and decompress a bit after talking through all it. Wanted to make space if there's anyone else that wanted to ask a question real quick. If not, feel free to come up to us afterwards. Thank you all for participating. Thank you so much to our incredible panelists. Yes. And thank you all for being here and just listening as well.